and welcome to the third video in our series on labor search frictions. In this video, we're going to keep going into labor market definitions, and we're going to look at some data and ask what is happening to the participation rate. And just to give the answer at the front, the participation rate is falling. This means that the total number of people that are in a working age but are also either working or searching for a job has been going down. In fact, after increasing dramatically since the 1960s, starting around 2000, it kind of stabilized and started going down. This figure is for the US, but similar patterns have been seen in other countries. In fact, it has fallen quite a bit. Even though 67 to 63% doesn't sound like a lot, this decrease accounts for about 8.2 million workers that have been lost relative to what the economy had at the beginning of the 2000s. And these 8.2 million workers really matter, because not only is fewer people that are working, that are producing, but it's also fewer people that are generating income for themselves and for their families. Now, one thing we can do to check this is how the participation rate differs across genders. And the figure we get is quite striking. The blue line here is the same line we had before. The red line is for women and the green line at the top is for men. And what we see is that men used to participate a lot more than they do today, and women a lot less. So women have been continuously increasing their participation steadily since the 1950s. And a lot of economists that have looked into this have shown that this is all carried out because of a change in behavior of married women. Single women actually pretty much participated at the same rate in the 1950s as they do today, but married women are the ones that are continuously joining the labor market. And this has very important implications for business cycles and the way the economy works. We're going to talk about that in just 2 slides. Now, in the contrast is what's happening to men. Men have been going out of the labor force almost continuously for 4 or 5 decades. And that trend is really worrisome. So let's think a little bit more about it. And just to give you a sense of the size of this change, in order to go to the 86% participation rate of the 1950s, today we will need about 17.5 men to join the labor force. This is quite a big change, thinking that in the US, 17.5 million men are kind of missing from the labor force relative to how many men were participating back in the 1950s. And Alan Kruger, who passed away a couple years ago, he had very influential papers where he was looking at what's behind the disappearance of all these workers, what's happening to them. And he found something that's very worrisome because it links the dropped out of the labor force to high rates of pain medication and prescription pain medication. And so a lot of economists have linked this trend of men falling out of the labor force to the increasing relevance of the opioid epidemic. And so we can see how this type of substance abuse can have very strong consequences for the economy because it's taking all these able-bodied people out of the labor force. So that's one thing. You can click on paper to get a link to the paper that Alan Kruger wrote. Bloomberg News also mentions this. There is a nice article where they relate both Alan Kruger's research and other research showing that a lot of men have been going through very spells of very long-term unemployment. And so other workers like David Autor at MIT, they have related these long-term unemployment spell periods to a structural change in the decline of manufacturing because of competition with companies overseas. And so places where manufacturing has been heavily hit lose their jobs permanently. And particularly men who used to work in manufacturing are hit hard and they end up going out of the labor force. And then in research that was actually just published 2 weeks ago, by Eric Hurst and a lot of his co-authors, they evaluate another source of variation that can be behind this decrease in the labor force. What they say is that certain technologies, such as video games, have made the value of leisure go up. And so they actually have very nice data showing that men between 21 and 30, a lot of them have not really worked in the previous year, and they are exchanging those hours of work for more hours of leisure in things like video games. And so as the quality of leisure goes up, it becomes less costly for people to sustain long periods of unemployment. Now, this is very worrisome because I'll read again the statistic. 22% of lower skilled men, 21 to 30, had not worked at all during the prior 12 months. That's over a fifth of young people without a single hour of work during the full year. This has very important consequences long term because it is exactly the time in the lives of these young workers where they are gathering experience and human capital that they're going to be able to use later on in life to get higher and better, higher paying jobs, better jobs with more stability. And so these trends all together are very, very worrisome, and they also affect communities like the one around London, where there is also a community that heavily favor manufacturing in the past, and as those things change, it's affecting how things work. Now, in the contrast, we had female participation. Now, what I'm going to focus on here is the fact that female participation was increasing very steeply, but then after around the 1990s and definitely after 2000, it has stopped working. It has stopped increasing. Sorry. And so here I want to cite the work of Stefania Albanese, who's a professor of economics at the University of Pittsburgh, who has extensively researched this. And I do invite you to click on the link to see her website. And in particularly a paper she has linking the changing business cycle dynamics to the role of women in employment. And there are three things I want to highlight about what she's saying. The first one is, as there is fewer increases in labor force participation of women, there is also a slower productivity gains. And so we do see now that productivity growth in the US has also stopped. It has decreased a lot since the 90s onto the 2000s. Then there is also a decline in business cycle volatility. Turns out that business cycles used to be very volatile, but as women were entering the labor market, they tend to work in industries that are less cyclical, that are less volatile. Because of that, the dynamics of business cycle changed, and then they started becoming less volatile, which allows for more control of the economy and more sustained growth. Now, as women stop getting into the labor market as much, that's also generating more volatility in the business cycle. And finally, female participation helped recoveries throughout the latter half of the 20th century. So what's happening is, even though here in the mid 70s and early 80s and beginning of the 90s, there were recessions hitting the US, the fact that there were more and more women joining the labor market, these additional workers, helped to take out the economy from the recession rather quickly without having to go into high levels of unemployment. Now, if you compare that to the last recession, the one in 2008, and to the recession we're having now, we actually have the opposite. We have what's called jobless recoveries. Output goes up, but total employment is not going up as much. And she can show in her paper that it's actually the decline in the increase of labor force participation amongst women that's to blame for this jobless recovery. So it's not only the fact that men are participating less, but the fact that women stopped increasing their participation rate is also hurting the way that the economy can recover from recession. So if you care about these topics, if you find interesting ways of thinking about how women have a very important role in shaping aggregate macroeconomic variables, I do invite you to check Estefania's work, which is really, really good. There is also other work showing that as labor force participation among women is slowing down, there is also rising income inequality. So this work basically shows that wage increases for men are driving high-skilled married women out of the labor force. So as there is more income inequality, and because there is also discrimination in the labor market, and these high-paying jobs are mostly going to men, there is also this force driving highly productive, highly educated women out of the labor force. And in another piece of new research, this is by a PhD student at Toulouse, um, she has found that on the other end of the distribution, as men, low skilled men are being driven out of their manufacturing jobs, they are going into clerical jobs, into caring type, type of caring jobs that were traditionally done by women, adding additional competition for these jobs and also driving women away from the labor market. And so these trends are worrisome again, because part of the miracle of growth during the second half of the 20th century and the taming of the business cycle is very tied to this higher growth of participation amongst women. So I do hope that you take a look at this, both the worrisome trends in men and the worrisome trends in the stop to the growth of labor force participation among women. In the next video, we're going to go back to other definitions. We're going to start talking about the demand side. So here we've developed definitions and we've seen data for what's happening to the supply side of the labor market. So who's working? But somebody has to hire them. And that's what we're going to do in the next video.